This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, great. So even before we met, so what I did is like I created two different virtual machines, one sitting in let's say West US 2, the other sitting in UK South, and both of the virtual machines are listening, or both of the virtual machines are residing in altogether, different virtual networks. So for this particular virtual machine, the virtual network address is something like 10.3.0.0/16, which is a different address space when compared to a virtual machine which is in West US, which is listening at let's say a 10.2.0.0/16. So two altogether very different address spaces, two altogether very different virtual networks. Right? This is the setup basically that I put in. So I now want to go ahead and install IIS on let's say top of one virtual machine. But the issue with this is that while I was creating it, I did not place a public IP here. I did not want to go ahead and place a public IP here, but I still want to go ahead and execute my scripts. So one way is a run command, right? This is what we were talking about. You can go to run command, run a PowerShell script, and put in a PowerShell script out here. This is one way of doing it, but a better way of managing this is using something called as a custom script extensions. Now, this is a screen that we'll be able to see while the creation of the virtual machine also. Like when I try to create a virtual machine out here, and when I say, okay, fine, the virtual machine is a Windows server and something like that, in the advanced section, it'll also say, you know what is the extension that you want to install. This is something it gives you an option out here also. Like it'll give you an option to go ahead and install some custom script extensions here also. But for now, since I've created it, I can also go inside it after creation, and I can say extensions. And the extension that I want to install right now is a PowerShell script, because that PowerShell script that I have will go ahead and install, let's say, something known as an IIS on top of it, and display just like, hey, you know what, this is what, and stuff like that. And now I can say add the extension, and here I have like many extensions out here. Like I can add an extension for monitoring, I can add an extension for antivirus, I can do a lot of things out here. But I just want to add an extension for something called, or basically to facilitate a PowerShell script, and that can be done using something called as a custom script extension. And all these things like the Datadog agent and all these things are monitoring tools, so you can also go ahead and install those extensions out here. So I'll say for my purpose right now, I am doing a custom script extension, and it says, you know what, custom script extension is a tool basically that will help you, run PowerShell scripts and all that stuff. I'll say, okay, fine, create. Now, as and when I say create a custom script extension, it will tell me where is your script file, from where do you want to upload it. Now, there is one issue with this. You cannot upload it from your local machine. You will need a storage account to upload it. You will need a storage account in the same region to go ahead and upload this particular script. So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, fine, let me create a basic storage account in the same region in which the virtual machine is, which is in UK South. So I'll say, okay, fine, great. Go ahead to a storage account. Let's say create a storage account, and I'll say, okay, fine. It is this particular resource group that I've created, and I'll say this is custom script extension STOR account to give a meaningful name. It was exceeding 24 characters. So now I'll just go ahead and say UK South because it's the same region, and I'll just take an LRS. It's a very simple storage account. I'll say review and create. So I just took the particular region and I just said, okay, fine, this is the region basically in which the storage account is, because that's where I want to install something known as a custom script extension. And while this is getting installed, let me go ahead and take my file out here. So it's the same file basically that I'll be using. It's the same file basically that we were installing the scripts and all these things out. So I have the IIS out here. IIS install. It's just gonna do something like It's a very simple PowerShell script, which is going into, let's say, that particular machine. It's saying firstly import a module called server manager, and server manager module basically helps you to install something known as a Windows feature, and the feature basically that I'm trying to install is called a Windows server, and I'll say include management tools. These two lines will help you install IIS on top of any machine. In our case, a virtual machine. Next, I'm saying okay, fine, set content. You have something called as a www root folder. Inside that, give me a file called, or create a file called default.html, and pass in a value called this is the server, and I'm just giving a predefined variable out here, dollar environment hyphen computer name. Now if I do this for my computer, it's saying desktop something like this. These are all predefined variables, and if you execute it on the virtual machine, it will give you the name of the virtual machine. In our case, it is VM2 or something like that. Since I executed it for my computer and my local machine, it's giving me this particular value. This is the name of the computer that I just put in for my own convenience out here. Fine. So this is, let's say, the script basically that I'm using out here. And I'll say, okay, fine, great. Now what I'll do is I'll go into the storage account. I'll create a container. I'll say PowerShell. I'll say create. And I'll just upload the file inside but that particular container out here. I'll say fine, great, go ahead. I'll say IIS install.ps1. So once this file is uploaded, now I'll now come to, let's say, the virtual machine again and go into the extensions. And now I'll say add an extension. And this particular extension, now I'm going to choose custom script extension as the extension that I want to install. I'll say create. And now I'll say browse. And this is the storage account now getting reflected because it's in the same region. I'll say this is the storage account. This is the container. This is the file. Select. And any additional arguments? No, not required because I have not parameterized anything in my script. I'll say OK. Now it says initializing deployment, meaning it is now including something known as a custom script extension out here into my particular virtual machine. And it is now going ahead and deploying that particular custom script extension. So if I give it a refresh right now, after a couple of minutes, the custom script extension is going to take somewhere around 5 to 10 minutes to basically go ahead and do its own job. So right now it's just deploying that particular extension out here. This is again a resource within a virtual machine. So it's deploying this particular extension, and after a couple of minutes, this is going to go ahead and run that particular PS1 file on my virtual machine. That's what it's just gonna do. Like this, let's say you have a machine, right? And you have a machine without a public IP. Can you have a machine without a public IP? Certainly yes. And in a real-time environment, guys, this is how it is going to be. You will not have a public IP to manage, because if you are exposing a public IP, right? Like especially if it's not a web server, especially if it is not a web server, they will not give you a public IP at all. In my project, I have like a lot of machines, a lot of virtual machines, but I do not have a public IP at all on top of that virtual machines out there. So for you to manage things, let's say you want to basically install Google Chrome, install Visual Studios and everything, you can write custom PowerShell scripts and place it into something called as a custom script extension that will facilitate. Guys, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So you cannot do that with, let's say, a run command. Like a run command just gives you, basically a very simple, command out here where you can just put in some PowerShell, but you cannot basically go ahead and declare your scripts that are parameterized and all. But in the real time, we use this particular concept called extensions a lot. We use this concept called an extension a lot, and this will facilitate most of your workload. Like it says deployment is successful, and once you refresh it, right, a couple of times, it will say it is in a provisioning state and all that stuff. It says provision succeeded. Now, if you view the detail, right, it would have saying, you know what, okay, fine, this particular script is executed, and I have like, placed a document called something like this. This is basically how you use something known as a custom script extension. So very importantly, what do we need? We need a storage account that hosts all our scripts, all our PowerShell scripts, or shell scripts or bash scripting, whatever language that you're following. Since I'm following PowerShell a lot, so I'm just taking the example of PowerShell. So I'll say .ps1 is my storage account, and I will basically upload this into something known as a custom script extension inside this particular blade called extensions out here. So I've added an extension, and I went ahead and let's say gone ahead and executed a PowerShell script out there. So this is how you will do it, guys. Guys, any questions with this particular topic called? Yeah.
Yeah, can we use these extensions to run on multiple machines?
For one machine, you can only have one particular extension. But if you
Okay.
want to run this particular extension on multiple machines at the same time during the deployment, you'll have to automate it using an ARM template. I'll also show you how an example for it. I have like a couple of examples. I can show that also.
Okay.
But
And
in
is
this extension, yeah,
yeah,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead,
go ahead,
Chandra.
go ahead, go ahead.
Can we schedule any scripts through extensions, or is there any other way?
So for scheduling, right, you'll have to come down to something called as an automation account again, like the one we were discussing about while creating ASR, Azure Site Recovery, right?
Okay.
That is generally used to, let's say, run patching and everything on your virtual machines.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Uh,
No problem.
but in this extension, it's a big way, right? So we need to add the extension on each and every VM, and we need a storage account for this. Instead of that, can we use that run PowerShell?
You can use a run PowerShell, but the thing is, Chandra, is that run PowerShell command will not give you an option to go ahead and write complex PowerShells. Like very simple basic PowerShells are okay, but let's say a PowerShell has a lot of arguments that you need to pass and etc. And you do not want to do it in, let's say, using run command. In that cases, that's when we use extensions out here. Like very simple PowerShells, I'm good with run commands. But complex PowerShell scripting is what I would suggest that we can go ahead with the extensions. And there's a way to automate this out. Like normally what we do is like we put all our scripts, let's say, in something like a GitHub repository, and we use the ARM templates in order to call the scripts there. So I will even show you a demonstration on how do we do that, and how do we generally write our ARM templates and etc. Like from a very basic ARM template to a very advanced ARM templates. So I'll even go ahead and demonstrate that also.
Okay, great.
Okay. So because some ARM templates is something that we haven't touched since a good amount of time. We have discussed ARM templates and PowerShell scripting for, let's say, storage accounts, but we haven't done the same thing for virtual machines, because the main important thing that I wanted to do is firstly give all the concepts of the virtual machine and then apply it using automation. Because it makes no sense if I just go ahead with the automation without explaining what exactly it is. That becomes a bit difficult to follow. But once we are done with connectivity and etc., we'll take one separate class or two classes and then go with automation on PowerShell scripts and how do we write it, what are the complexities and what are the challenges and etc. Because in real time, guys, like PowerShells and everything, that is going to be like your bread and butter. So I will definitely help you all in doing that. And also going forward, what I'll do is like I have a few sample scripts basically that I write in order to make my life easy. So I'll upload that into a public GitHub repository and give the link to you so that you can download it also for your references and for for future purposes. So that's going to be my plan. So is this concept okay, guys? Is this custom script extension okay? Did everyone follow this out? Does anyone have any questions here? Okay. So what did I do just now is that I uploaded something called as an IIS, and I basically put in a file called default.html. Inside that file, I have just written something like hello from this particular virtual machine and etc. But one thing to note here is that this particular machine does not have a public IP address, meaning I am just telling the world, or I'm just declaring that, hey, you know what? This particular virtual machine is not a public server, rather it's a private server. This is not a server that should be visited over the internet. Meaning, can it happen that way? Definitely yes. Like the applications that you use in your organization, inside your organization, like for example, I belong to an organization called XYZ, and they have an application called xyz.com, which helps me fill up my time, which helps me basically charge for my project and etc. Now, do you all think that application should be accessed by everyone? Definitely not, right? Because that can be misused and all. That's the reason we do not expose the public IP for web servers that are not internet applications but are intranet applications, which are inside your organizations, right? So then how can I basically from inside the organization access this particular thing? Like, can I do something like default.html over a private IP address? This will throw an error no matter how many times you do it. No matter how many times you do it, it's going to throw an error telling that, hey, you know what, I couldn't find that website. I'm not able to resolve the name of this particular website because I am using a public IP address right now. I am coming from a public IP address and hitting this particular website. And this particular virtual network is identifying that, hey, you know what, this particular guy is not a part of my virtual network because the IP that I'm using right now, for example, what's my IP? It's something like, an IPv6 address basically that I do have. So it's telling me, you know what, this is the IP address that you belong to. And this virtual network automatically has kicked me out. Automatically has said, you know what, you're not a part of my virtual network. And I have a rule called deny all inbound. Anything inside my virtual network, I am good with it. But anything outside, anything that is alien to me, meaning when will I be an alien? When I am not in the same address space. If you are not in the same address space, you are simply thrown out, telling that, hey, you know what, you are not a part of this one address space, so you will not be able to access this website no matter how many times you do it. And your computer will not be able to understand or will not be able to resolve something called as this particular DNS. It will not be able to resolve this particular name. Then what can I do? So what I did is, like, I basically had a server basically in West US2, and I have a public IP to it, and I have enabled RDP to it. So people from the outside world can still go ahead and, let's say, use that public IP because it is publicly accessible, right? So I'll say, okay, great. Let me go into that particular server. And one thing to note is that even that particular server is altogether in a different virtual network, in a different region also. Like VM1 is sitting, let's say, in a virtual network with a public IP, like something like this. And the virtual network in which this is sitting in is completely different from the virtual network in where my VM2 is sitting in. So what I'll do right now is I'll try to do an RDP into it. And I will try to access the VM2 from within the VM1. So I'm getting here. I'm coming here. And this particular virtual machine is sitting in an address space of what? 10.2.0.0 or 0.4. And this particular virtual machine is sitting altogether in a different address space called 10.3.0.4. I'm talking about the private IP addresses right now. And both right now are aliens to each other. They do not know who each other are because they are isolated using this particular virtual networks that they, basically they have. Fine. So what I'll do right now is, like, okay, fine. I'll come to my virtual machine 1 and I'll go into my virtual machine 1 right now. And this is running on a Windows Server 2019. And what I'll do right now is I'll say, okay, fine. Let's go to the local servers and disable this one out. Say IE enhanced is disabled. IE enhanced is disabled. And now I'll go to the Internet Explorer so that I can basically use this out. Ask me later. Say IE disabled. Fine, disabled. Great. Now what I'll do is like I'll try to take the private IP address of this particular virtual machine 2, and let me try hitting that particular virtual machine from this particular server. .html. It still throws me an error. It will still go ahead and throw me an error telling me that, you know what, now since it's Microsoft Bing, it's just saying, you know what, yeah, I have something like this, and it's giving me a search out here. But normally if you use the Google Chrome browser, it'll just throw an error telling that, you know what, I don't understand what you're trying to talk about, or rather I do not know what this address is about. And it's just doing a simple Google search or a Microsoft Bing search and giving me all the entries out here, meaning two different virtual machines sitting in two different virtual networks altogether and two different regions altogether. But I want to facilitate the connection. Why do I want to facilitate the connection? Because both the machines are of my same organization. I am okay to, you know, go ahead and have my machine 1 talk to machine 2. For that, since both the virtual networks are in a completely different region, the facilitation is possible using a concept called virtual network peering. What am I doing is that I am peering both of my virtual networks. I am establishing a very minute connection between both of my virtual networks, and this connection is called as a peering connection. Now we are coming into a concept called connectivity, guys, that how can you securely connect to your machines, how can you do what and all that stuff. So I want to peer my virtual network that is sitting in West US2 to a virtual machine that are to a virtual network that is sitting in UK South. I want to establish a connection between these two guys, this and this particular virtual network out here. I want to establish a connection. Then how do I do it? So let me go into one of the virtual networks. Which virtual network? Not an issue, but I just want to go into one of the virtual networks. Let's say this is in West US2, and here in the virtual network, I have an option called peering. I have something known as a peering out here. I'll say peerings, and I'll say add a peering. This is how I create a peering between VNet 1 and VNet 2. And one thing you will have to understand is that a peering is a two-way connection. VM1 will be able to talk to the resources inside VNet 2, and VM2 will be able to talk to the resources in VM or in VNet 1. Meaning this connection is a two-way bridge. Meaning if you create a peering for this particular virtual network, right? Automatically Azure is going to create a peering between virtual network 2 and virtual network 1. So I'm imagining that this is my virtual network 1 out here, which is sitting in, let's say, the West US2. So what I'll tell is like right now, I'll say, okay, fine. I will establish a name for this peering called VNet 1 to VNet 2. This is the direction of peering. I'll say, yes, allow all the traffic. I want all this to be allowed. And I'll just go with the default values for now. I'll say allow forwarded traffic. I'll say, you know, go ahead and let's say, I mean, traffic to the remote virtual network is allowed. Allow forwarded traffic from virtual network from remote virtual network is allowed because I want to allow all my traffic. And now I'll say, now it says, okay, fine, gateway is like none. Let's take this as none right now. Let's understand this at later point in time. Now it's saying, again, it's asking me a peering link name. Now this is the link name from VNet 2 to VNet 1. The second bridge that I'm trying to establish. Since it's a two-way bridge, it's a two-way connection. I need to give two different peering links name right now. Now it's asking me, okay, fine. What is the virtual network that you want to peer me with? Now it has a lot of virtual networks out here. If I select the same virtual network, right? it's saying, you know what, select a different virtual network, because a virtual network cannot be paired with itself. Very simple. Why do you want to establish a bridge like that? So peering test VNet is the virtual network I'm working on. So I cannot use the same virtual network out here. So I'll use a different virtual network in which my VM2 is sitting in, which is peering test VNet 345. And now it says same thing for that network also, telling that, you know what, allow remote traffic, yes, allow forwarded traffic, yes. And by default, this is like none. So I'll say, okay, fine. This is great. I'll go with the default values. Now I'll add a peering. Now when I said add a peering, right, it did two things. It added a peering in peering test VNet, and it also added a peering in peering VNet 345 also. And this peering should be successful. Like right now the status is updating, but after some time, now it says, you know what, the peering is this direction. You have peered the peering name is something like VNet 1 to VNet 2, and you have peered with a virtual network called peering test VNet 345. This is, let's say, the virtual network that you have kind of peered with. Great. If I go to this particular virtual network, if I, let's say, go to this particular virtual network out here, and if I go into the peerings of it, now I haven't even come to this particular virtual network yet. If I go to the peering of it, I already have a peering. This is the two-way bridge that I'm talking about. This virtual network is now peered with this particular virtual network called peering test VNet, which is my first virtual network, which is sitting in, let's say, West US 2 region. And the name of the peering is VNet 2 to VNet 1. So that's the name that we have like given in that particular bridge. So I'll say erase all drawings and go to my first virtual network right now again. And see, here it is VNet 1 to VNet 2, status is connected. Now it says, hey, you know what? These two machines are now connected. Can you try now? I'll go into my virtual machine 1 again, take the same page, put it in here. Now it says, you know what? This is the server VM2. I can also go ahead and do an RDP to this particular machine. Over its private IP without even having an RDP port open. Without even having basically an RDP port open out there. I don't even have to have a RDP port open. Reason being, I have this rule that which controls right now. Now, if I look at my virtual machine out here, this is VM1. I have a default rule. I have a default network security group rules that controls this out, telling all the VNet inbound. Now, when I peered it, both the virtual networks are now being acting as one virtual network. Like it is not two different entities, it's only one entity. Now if I look at this particular thing, guys, now I am into the VM2 right now. I'm into the VM2 right now over its private IP. This is what, or this is the ability what virtual network peering kind of gives me to. And the one that I did right now is called a global peering, because I peered two different virtual networks that are sitting in two different regions altogether. If you peer two different virtual networks sitting in the same region, it's called a regional peering because you are doing it in the same region. This is the concept of peering, guys. Now, one thing to remember, or just to give a recap, I'm just doing. I had two virtual networks, two virtual machines inside one virtual network respectively. Two at very different virtual network. I mean, two at very different address spaces, very different regions. So we went ahead and we established something called as a peering. I went ahead and I said, okay, fine, peering is done. Now I went ahead into the first virtual machine and did, let's say, ping, or let's say look at the second virtual machine over its private IP, and now it was able to respond to me. This is how you establish a peering, guys. Now the question is, what if I have a third virtual machine? What if, let's say, I have, let's say, a third different virtual machine out here, sitting in altogether a very different virtual network and altogether a very, different location. Let's say North Europe. Do I have to now peer this as well? Yes, you have to. Do I have to peer this to VM1 and also VM2? No, you don't have to. Just peer it with one of the virtual networks, and while establishing a peer, right, we have said something called allow remote traffic. Traffic forwarded from a remote virtual network. The setting allows you to forward peering traffic that is not originating from something like this. Meaning, even if it's a remote virtual network, allow the traffic to flow over this peering network. So even if it's a remote virtual network out here, and if you peer these both of them, this particular virtual machine, VM3, is going to use VM1 as a proxy to get into VM2. That this is the route which it takes. So VM3 again, if I go ahead and peer it out, go ahead and let's say peer this out with this particular virtual network VM1, this VM3 is going to route its traffic into VM2 using VM1. This is called a proxy. And let's say if I have another virtual machine VM4, which is peered to this particular network, even this can do the same to VM1. It can come here through VM2, use VM2 as a proxy, and go into the virtual network of of VM1. This is how I can establish multiple connections, meaning I can chain multiple connections out here. This is how I can effectively use something known as a virtual network to virtual network peering. Guys, any questions with this? Did everyone get this concept out?
Yeah, this peering can be done across the region, right? As we discussed.
Yes, correct. So if the peering is done across the region, it's called a global peering.
Okay, and in those region, IP address should not be same, right? Same
Exactly.
sub.
I mean, yes, it should not be, meaning your address spaces should not overlap with each other. Only then you will be able to peer things out.
Okay, irrespective of any subnet, right? 10.2 here, 192 or 172, whichever network,
Yes,
it can connect.
whichever network it is, you can connect.
Okay, and can we make it for subnet instead of virtual machine, like 10.2 series, 10.3 series to connect?
I mean, see, what you're doing is essentially is that you're not really connecting virtual machines out here. Now, I just use the concept of virtual machines to explain peering, but you're connecting both the virtual networks out here. So if here you have a web server, like a virtual network, sorry, a virtual machine, and here you have, let's say, a SQL database, your virtual machines can still go ahead and connect to it or and communicate to it. So, and let's say if I, deploy a new virtual machine in this network tomorrow, even this will have connection to everything else apart. I mean, everything else basically inside this particular network out here. So this is how the concept actually propagates out there. Does it answer your question, Sanjay?
Yes, I got it. And in
Yeah.
this peering, it will go through internet, right? Uh, to communicate.
No, it will not go to internet to communicate. It will use the intranet to communicate,
Okay,
or also called as Microsoft Azure backbone networks.
okay, okay,
So it's not using the internet at all.
okay. Got it. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions,
Okay.
guys? Mhm.
What
But
if we have these same network spaces on both the locations?
So firstly, if you have a same network space on both the locations, your peering will kind of fail, telling that, what, these are overlapping addresses and I will not be able to peer it. And even when you create a virtual network, it kind of will, give you a warning telling that, what, hey, you are creating an overlapping address space out here. So please take care of it. So in that case, if
Okay.
you're hypothetically, if you create, let's say, the same address space, then there is no need of peering at all because it's the same space, right?
Yeah, but region is different, right? So
Region
those
is different,
cannot be
yes.
communicated.
Correct. But the thing is that it is not really, I mean, virtual network concepts are not really looking for which region you are in. It's looking for which address space you are in. So even if you're in a different region, if you are in the same address space, then it is certainly possible to go ahead and establish a connection out there.
Okay. Okay. Great.
Okay, and yeah, Akila, you had a question?
Yeah, but yesterday we opened the RDP right by using the private IP. So why
Mm-hmm.
would, but why were not are unable to open this now?
Which one? I'm sorry. Okay. So yesterday, what happened is that all your virtual machines, without peering, were able to communicate over RDP because everything was in the same virtual network. Like all your virtual machines are in the same virtual network. Now, if I go ahead and let's say deploy a new virtual machine in the same virtual network, in the same address space, in the same region, you do not need to basically go ahead and open a port out here, or you do not need to establish a peering out here because they are in the same virtual network. They can communicate with each other. But if it's in a different virtual network is when I'm talking about a peering.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And Sanjay brings a very important point that does this virtual machines talk to each other over the internet, or will it take a different route? This is a concern for a lot of companies, is that let's imagine that this is a web server sitting in, let's say, West US, and you have a storage account that is sitting in, let's say, UK South, and this web server is now interacting with this particular storage account to store logs and to store a lot of data and all that stuff. Okay, to do a lot of stuff, it wants to communicate with this particular storage account out here, which is good, which I can understand, which I can do and all that stuff. Now, the thing is, if I establish a peering right now, the virtual machines are able to communicate over a private IP over the intranet, not the internet. But can I establish, or can I force my virtual network, or can I force my network traffic to be routed not over the internet and the not over the internet and the intranet so that it can reach this particular storage account? Certainly, yes. That particular concept is called service endpoints. Inside a virtual network, you have something known as a service endpoint. Service endpoints are there in place so that the traffic that basically your web servers are communicating to the other resources are minimized to go over the internet. Then how will it really go? If it's not using the internet, then what kind of or where will your traffic be routed to? Now there is a concept called Microsoft Azure backbone. It's called a backbone because virtual networking, guys, is like the is really the backbone of any cloud provider, because that's what makes cloud more secure. Now, if I say Microsoft Azure backbone network, and go into this particular page out here, it says, hey, you know what? I have my own private internet connections. Let's take images and let's use this particular image as, let's say, a tool to explain this out. Now, Microsoft has different data centers across different parts of the world. Like it has like different data centers. All these data centers are connected through what? Using cables, right? Because physically they'll have to be connected with something or the other. At the end of the day, it kind of boils down to a cable. Now, who's providing the cable? Is it your internet service provider, let's say, who's providing the cable? Or is it Microsoft itself who's like laying out these lines? If it is Microsoft who's laying out these lines, and in reality, yes, it is the same way. It is Microsoft who lays all these cables out. These are the private cables of Microsoft to establish communication over different data centers, over its different data centers over the world. This particular network is known as an Azure backbone. This particular network basically is called as an Azure backbone network, which will only divert traffic that is concerned with Microsoft and its products. Azure falls under that big category of it. And when you enable something called as a service endpoint, now I want to enable service endpoint for this virtual network so that the traffic can go over the backbone to a storage account. I'll say, okay, fine. Service is Microsoft Azure storage, and endpoint policies you do not have to declare. Subnet is all the subnets. Make sure all the subnets basically are taking this route and say add. That's it you have to do. You just have to enable something known as a service endpoint. As in, when you enable a service endpoint, the traffic will not go over the internet. The traffic will now go over the intranet, meaning Microsoft will force all the traffic to go through something known as an Azure backbone, and all the traffic that reaches Microsoft storage, like that particular service, will go through this particular point. Can I have multiple service endpoints for different services? Definitely yes. You can have multiple service endpoints for different services as well. This is how the concept kind of works, guys. So any questions, guys, with this? Anything?
When it use intranet, will there be any delay compared to internet?
No, it will actually be more faster than the internet,
Okay, even
because
across the region, right?
even across the region, it will be more faster than the internet, because internet traffic is general traffic. Like you have, if I send an email, it'll go over the internet. It will, if I do a communication, it'll go over the internet. But intranet traffic is very specific. Intranet traffic is only for Microsoft products. Like Azure backbone is only used for, let's say, Azure and its own services.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else, guys? Any other questions out here? Now, one quick thing out here is that we've spoken about virtual machines, we enable public IPs to virtual machines and all these things. But in an organization, guys, when you work in an organization, you most likely will not have a public IP address at all. The issue with having a public IP address is that if, let's say, your credentials are exposed, if, let's say, someone gets a hand over this particular credentials, they will be able to log into your virtual machine from anywhere or any part in the world. From anywhere as such from the world, they can actually go into your virtual machine. They can do whatever they want. Reason because of, I mean, this is one of the biggest concerns, that the security is one of the biggest concerns when we look at a company. So they don't enable public IP addresses at all. We don't enable public IP addresses at all to any virtual machine. So even this particular possibility, what you're talking about doing an RDP, right? Even this is ruled out. There is, no matter what, you cannot come from the outside world. You cannot basically just barge into someone's network. Like one rule that is like flat out there. Like any organization you're working with, one rule they'll flat out tell you that, you know what, then something like this. Then the question is, then how will I manage my entire infrastructure if it's not for it? Then how will I really manage this out? How will I make sure to actually go into Azure and log into this particular virtual machine, right? One of the biggest concerns that I have, because right now everyone is like doing a remote work from home, remote works and all these things are very popular. So I, as an individual, I use my own laptop. I use my own internet. Like my internet is a public internet, because not only me, but a lot of people basically are using the internet which I am on. And I want to basically connect with my organization. I want to basically connect with my organization's network, and I want to establish a secure connection. and my organization doesn't even allow a public IP for even one virtual machine. Like we have something called a concept called as an Azure policies. And what we do is like we enforce a policy so that no one can actually create a public IP address within, let's say, the network, within, let's say, the organization network. So one thing flat out, I cannot, basically even give one particular public IP to anyone. I cannot really allow someone to, visit over a public IP. For the exact purpose, you have a concept called VPN. A lot of people might have used this, virtual private network. There is a concept called a VPN, virtual private network, and it's the same concept if you apply into, let's say, to AWS, it's called VPC, virtual private cloud. Virtual private network is a concept out here which all the organizations use it in one of the other form. This is one universal thing that is available out there. This will allow you to connect to a virtual network or connect to a virtual machine over its private IP without exposing a public IP out there. And this connection, right, between my laptop to my network, like I'm an individual to my laptop to my network, is called a point to site connection. It's known as what? A point to site. Point, I am the point, site is this one. If you apply the same thing to two different offices working over two different virtual networks and do not want to establish a peering, because in most of the peering, right, like most of the services, if you do not enable a service endpoint, most of the services are going to take the internet route. You don't want this to happen. Then you can establish a connection between both the organizations using a concept called site to site. And in site to site, again, you have different things like site to site VPN, site to site express route, and all that stuff. But the concepts what we are going to get into are pretty dynamic, pretty complex. So I would need one full hour to explain what a point to site is. Like you need to do a lot of things out here. You kind of basically, get into a concept called certificates and how do you install certificates and what's a VPN gateway and what is a gateway firstly to begin with and all that stuff. So what I'm gonna do is like I'm gonna take this concept all together on Monday, since we are not connecting tomorrow. I'll take this concept all together fresh on Monday, but I want you all to read about point to site, guys. Point to site VPN Azure. I want you all to read about it. I want you all to understand what this is, and we will go for a demo on Monday. This is one of the most important concepts, guys. Believe me, every organization will be using some or the other kind of a VPN. Like most of y'all, I'm pretty sure, would have used a VPN by now. Like you would have definitely gone into your system connected to something like a Cisco VPN or connected to something like any company's VPN, private VPN and stuff like that. And only after you connect to a VPN is when you go ahead and let's say use the resources of your office, right? Until then, you won't be able to do that. And if you want to connect to a VPN, let's say the same VPN over your local machine, meaning over your personal laptop and not your office laptop, it'll throw an error because your VPNs are authenticated over something known as a certificate. And certificates are provided by your organization. That's how we establish authentication out there, guys. So I'm not explaining what a VPN right now is. I'm just telling what is the concept that we're going to get into. And on Monday is when we'll go ahead and do a practical demo on what a VPN is, how do you establish a VPN, what are the complexities, what are the moving parts out here, and what are the things that we need to take care of. Today, what I'll want you to do is go ahead, use this concept called peering, and make sure that you go into it and make sure that you read the documentations and make sure that you have the complete documentation of it and read about it and do a bit of trial errors with, let's say, peerings. And one thing, guys, that I want you all to do, like religiously, is like maintain an Excel sheet. Like whatever concepts that we've covered till now, just maintain an Excel sheet, like I do. Like for every class, I kind of get an Excel sheet out here, and this is what I follow. Like, okay, fine, these are the concepts that I need to cover. And these are, let's say, I mean, are there any comments basically, or are there any links basically that I can share with my class? So this is how I maintain, let's say, my Excel sheets out here. And I say, okay, fine, this is what are the concepts that are left. This is what I need to cover. This is something that I want to basically cover today and stuff like that. The same thing, please go ahead, make an Excel sheet out there, put all the necessary links basically, and this will really help you out when you're giving the interviews. And interview questions from a virtual machine and a virtual networks, there are a lot. What's a service endpoint? What is the use of a service endpoint? What do you mean by virtual network to virtual network peering? And how do you basically control the traffic that is coming in using NSGs and all that stuff? And what do you mean by high availability in a virtual network? How do you basically establish something known as a load balancing concept? How do you basically connect two different virtual networks? Can you do it through automation and all that stuff? So please make sure to note down the questions, and we'll also take off some time basically in between our classes to discuss about what are the interview questions that can come through it. What are the questions basically that an interviewer can really ask you all when you're giving an interview for a role like let's say an IaaS engineer. Like the concepts what you're talking about is all IaaS engine is all, let's say, IaaS, right? So for an IaaS engineer or an IaaS specialist, what are, let's say, the questions basically that they can ask? What is the networking basically that you need to be aware of? This is something that we will regularly keep discussing about. And once I am right now here, like this is where I am. So I basically have something like a point to site to explain. Site to site is something I can give you a theoretical understanding of it, because site to site needs a physical infrastructure and all, which I don't have. So point to site and I can explain, I can give the same concept for site to site. And after DNS is when we are going to take a look into the ARM templates on, let's say, how to basically create a virtual machine and all that stuff. With that, we will end this particular concept called IaaS, and then we'll move into something known as PaaS. So this is the plan, guys. So any questions with this, or any questions in general that I can take? Anything, guys? Any questions, guys? Any questions, concerns?
Yeah, when we are creating peering,
Mhm.
will there be any security compromise because we are doing across the regions, right? Can anyone
So
hack those kind of things?
if yes, if it is like going through the internet, yes, definitely they can hack. They will definitely hack if it is going through the internet, and that's the reason most of the companies do a site to site rather than a peering.
Okay.
In that way, your communications are encrypted.
Okay.
But peering with a service endpoint, that is more secure.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, guys. So any further questions? Is everyone able to follow the concepts that what we are covering out? Like, are there any doubts in anything that we have discussed till now? Okay, so if there are no further questions, guys, then have a great weekend ahead and have a great festival. And we will meet on Monday.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.